But this was something that was unsustainable. It led to the dot-com boom and then the dot-com bust. And industrial country corporations suddenly became very circumspect and said, we're not going to invest as much as we were investing. So industrial country investment dropped dramatically. So if corporations are not investing, if governments are not willing to spend too much, who's going to step up to the plate and provide the demand that the rest of the world is looking for? Turned out that it was households, particularly U.S. households, which increased their consumption and increased their purchase of housing assets. So housing investment in the U.S. took off. In a sense, the U.S. was the demander of last resort for the world. The rest of the world was shrinking its demand. The U.S. expanded. Of course, all of us protested and said, how can the U.S. be such a spendthrift? How can the U.S. spend more than it can afford? Well, it could because the rest of the world was financing it. And the rest of the world was equally dependent on the U.S. because the U.S. was providing that demand. So what happened was, as a result of this excess demand being generated in the U.S., the rest of the world was being kept afloat. But in order to finance this, the U.S. had to find some way of making it possible to take U.S. assets which were being financed and sell it to the rest of the world. But the assets the U.S. was creating was housing assets. Typically, a housing loan is a very local loan. I know the borrower as a banker, and I do a due diligence. I make sure that they're adequate credit risks, and I make the loan and hold on to it. This was the kind of loan that was being made in the United States, but the kind of investor who was emerging to finance this was away in the Philippines or was away in Germany. They couldn't hold on to this loan directly because they had no capacity to understand what the quality of the borrower was, what the quality of the household was, etc. And this is where the U.S. financial system stepped up to the plate. What the U.S. financial system did was it took these mortgages that were being made locally in Michigan, in Arizona, in Illinois, and put it into a package. And against that package, it issued securities. Now, because the package contained mortgages that were diversified across the country, there was a sense that the package was somewhat less riskier than each individual mortgage that it contained. And when you issued securities against it, some of the securities would be securities that would bear the first loss. Those would be risky securities. But other securities would be safer. Those were rated higher. In fact, these were the AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities that many of you have heard so much about. So these AAA mortgage-backed securities issued against U.S. housing assets were issued all around the world, made their way around the globe, and were held by investors in China, in Philippines, and so on. This was a good thing. It was a good thing because it helped the U.S. household create demand, which was then supplied by the rest of the world. It helped the U.S. household get financing, which was supplied by the rest of the world. The world was in a good equilibrium. The problem was, this didn't stop where it should have stopped. It went on too far. Once bankers understood that they could generate these mortgages and sell them to investors in Philippines, in China, in Germany, who didn't ask too many questions, they decided to do more of it. And they did more of it, and still more of it, until the credit quality started deteriorating, and it deteriorated substantially. But of course, the investor in China didn't understand that things were going sour, because U.S. house prices were going up, these mortgages were performing, they were functioning, no problems. Problems really started when eventually U.S. house prices started first stabilizing and then falling, and then more and more mortgages started defaulting, and that showed up in portfolios around the world. Now, thus far, all I've described is a situation where, investors who are somewhat gullible bought assets from an overly sophisticated U.S. financial system. And if that's where it stopped, investors around the world would have felt some pain, but it would have not been a global crisis. It turned into a global crisis because those excessively clever, sophisticated U.S. bankers also held on to too many of these mortgages themselves. instead of selling them around the world, they held them on their own portfolios. Of course, you can ask why they held on to them on their own portfolios, and this is, in a sense, the $8 trillion question now. Why were they so stupid as to hold these assets on their portfolio? And I think as we explore this issue more and more, we come up with a couple of answers. One answer was it was tremendous management failure from the top down. If you recall, Chuck Prince, who was the chairman of Citibank, made the statement in July of last year when asked why his bank was taking on so much risk in making covenant-light loans to private equity transactions, why they were taking on so much risk. He essentially said, while the music's playing, we have to dance, and the music's still playing. What he meant was that in a competitive environment, it's very hard for one bank to stop lending and saying, the risks are too high, we can't, there aren't enough profits here. He has to join the herd and continue lending because other people are making profits. He also has to show profits. In many ways, this explains why Merrill Lynch went into the whole business. Merrill Lynch, led by Stan O'Neill, it was trying to emulate Goldman's profits in this business. But of course, Merrill Lynch didn't have the kind of risk controls that Goldman Sachs had, and Merrill Lynch went down the tubes. Similarly, with Citibank, we had a significant fall in Citibank as a result of these crazy investments. But also, I think the bankers here will understand that we had a breakdown within the bank itself, and that comes from the compensation structures that were prevalent in the banking system. The kinds of compensation structures that we had essentially rewarded bankers for making quick profits, without thinking about whether these profits implied risks down the line. Let me give you an example of what the bankers were doing. Think about an insurance company writing earthquake insurance. If the company writes earthquake insurance, there's somebody who buys that insurance and pays a premium up front. Now, earthquakes are very rare events. So the insurance company gets steady premiums every year. And the person writing this insurance, if you didn't know that he was writing this insurance, you'd think he was a genius. He's making money for nothing. He's getting premium every year, and he's paying out nothing. What a wonderful way. What a free lunch. The problem, however, is every once in a while, earthquakes occur, at which point a substantial portion of the premium that he's accumulated so far has to be paid out as compensation to the earthquake victims who have bought insurance, right? Now,